Because their brains haven't had much time yet to fill with knowledge and experience, little kids explore and experiment and ask deep and endless questions. What they really want is to make sense of the world, which makes them ideal and often profound philosophers. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Jana Moore-Lone is Affiliate Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Washington and Director and Founder of the university's Center for Philosophy for Children. She's not assigning little kids to read Kant or Kierkegaard, though. What she wants is to engage their natural curiosity and their openness to new ideas and teach them to do philosophy, to think deeply about what matters to them and why, and to honor their desires to understand what it means to be human. Her essay, Philosophy with Children, appears on the website Eon. Jana, welcome to Think.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
How did you get the idea to start a Center for Philosophy for Children?
Well, a couple of things came together for me when I was a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Washington. Prior to working on my dissertation, I had been a lawyer and I'd worked a lot with women and children and seen that often children had difficulties taking control over the circumstances of their lives, in part just because of the nature of childhood, being young and having little power in society and still developing skills, but also because the legal system is not set up to empower children. It's set up to solve problems once they've already happened. And so I've been thinking a lot about how to help children to develop the skills that they needed to make their way in the world. And around the same time, I had young children. And my oldest son, Will, who was about 4 years old at the time I was about to complete my doctorate, was starting to ask the questions that young children ask. Why can't dogs talk? Why are people mean to each other? What makes someone a friend? And I started to think about myself as a child and remembering how I had had a lot of similar kinds of big questions. And although I knew that, I'd never really named it as philosophy or thought of children as philosophically inclined. And then I wondered, well, maybe this is just a genetic quirk in my family and is not true of most 4-year-olds. So I went to Will's preschool teacher and said, do you think I could come in and try to lead some conversations with the children about philosophical topics? And she was game. So I came in and started doing a series every week of discussions with these very young children about questions such as the nature of bravery, or what makes someone a friend, or what is fairness. And what I found was that these children were reliably interested in having these kinds of conversations, and in fact, often more reliably interested than some of my friends who would often say, okay, Jana, we don't need to get so philosophical all the time, etc. The children were always up for it.
Did you get a lot of pushback from adults who assumed that real philosophy is just way over the heads of children?
So it's interesting. I did not get a lot of pushback from parents who saw that their children were just really interested in making sense of the world and in understanding concepts that were challenging to figure out. So children often hear things like it's important to be fair, but to try to understand what fairness is a bit more complicated. So I would say I got a lot of positive feedback from parents. Really, the most challenging community was the professional philosophical community, who saw this as, I heard things like, well, that's just baby philosophy, or that's not real philosophy. And it took me a very long time to convince people that, in fact, this was real philosophy. And really, the problem was that we needed to think more clearly about what philosophy is. And I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No, please continue.
Well, and understand that I think in our society, we have this idea that philosophy is this esoteric activity that's done in the walls of academia by people with advanced degrees, and that anyone who doesn't fit within those categories is not equipped to do philosophy. But in fact, that's just one way of doing philosophy. quite a valuable way, I'll say, but it's only one way. When any of us ask questions that as human beings we ask all the time, why do people have to die? What's the purpose of my life? How do I know someone's a real friend? What's the right thing to do in this situation? We are engaged in philosophical thinking.
It's funny, Jana, I've realized as an adult that I really love philosophy, but I did not love the one semester of it I had in college because we dove straight into learning about the ancient Greeks and the major Enlightenment figures and what they had to say without ever in the class actually doing any philosophy for ourselves.
It's interesting. I often say to people, what I'm doing is actually setting the stage for greater interest in philosophy among these children as they grow up. I can't tell you how many children in elementary school will say to me, I'm going to be a philosopher when I grow up. And and that's really powerful, actually, because they think of philosophy as something very accessible to them. And one of the things that happens in undergraduate education, which, I mean, there's a lot of value in learning the arguments of the great philosophers or contemporary philosophers and trying to understand these very sometimes difficult arguments. But there's also value, as you point out, in just talking about the questions themselves, because that is at the heart of philosophy. That's what led to philosophy becoming something that is of interest to human beings, is we have these questions. And so making space for conversations about the questions without reference to the philosophical experts is very important, and I think is as important as what goes on in academia. It is also real philosophy, whether it's done with 5-year-olds or 90-year-olds.
So you mentioned your son's preschool. How do you structure philosophy lessons to school-age children?
So that's a great question, because sometimes I'll have people say to me, are you gonna bring like Descartes into a kindergarten class and read to them? So what we do is we bring in some prompt. Often it's a picture book. Picture books are marvelously philosophically suggestive, and we use them to prompt conversation. So we'll bring in a story, read the story, which also kind of sets up a very quiet and relaxed and non-intimidating environment. And then we'll ask the children, what questions does this make you wonder about? And we'll get a list of the questions that the children have, and then we'll facilitate a conversation with the children about one or two of the questions that they've put forth. And sometimes when we're talking about very young children, so say preschool, kindergarten, we're helping them to formulate questions, to understand what makes a good question, to be able to articulate their questions. But certainly as they get older, as they get into second, third, fourth, et cetera, they are quite able to articulate very clearly the questions that arise for them out of whatever the prompt is.
And they can get really deep. You write about one conversation you had with fourth graders who decided they wanted to consider whether it is possible to be simultaneously happy and sad. What did you hear about that from a group of 9-year-olds?
So this was a conversation where we were just discussing the nature of happiness, and we started to talk about whether you could be happy and sad at the same time. And one of the students said, and I'll just quote, she said, I agree you can be happy and sad at the same time. Even though we think of sadness and happiness as opposites, they can sometimes be put together. That's usually moments when you feel happy in your life, and then you realize that your life isn't going to last forever. It will maybe last a long time. I'm only 9 years old, and I have my whole life ahead of me. But still, I want to stay in life, and I know I can't.
Wow. What do you remember about realizing that you would die someday?
Well, I think in some ways, this was my first philosophical moment as a child, waking up in the middle of the night and thinking, I'm going to die someday. One day, I might not exist. This me that is in the world might not be here anymore. And it was really frightening to me. And I started to try to make sense of it. Like, what does that mean? How can you be here one day and not be here the next? And it's interesting because many of the children with whom I work confirm that this is one of the topics they think about all the time. When I ask children, as I often do in kind of one of our initial sessions, what are the big questions you wonder about? Invariably, one of the questions is, why do people have to die? Or what happens when you die? Or what would life be like if people didn't die? Questions like that. In my latest book, Seen and Not Heard, there's a chapter about death and the conversations I've had with children, both about why people have to die, also would you choose to live forever if you could? And then a wonderful conversation I had with a group of, I think it was also fourth graders, about what happens when you die, where this group of 27 or so children had this conversation about their own beliefs about what happens after death, which ranged quite widely from children with very strong religious convictions to children who were unsure to children who were quite convinced that death was the end. And they were able to listen to each other and be open to what each other had to say in a way that was so moving and beautiful, because they really, although some of them held strong beliefs, they were really interested in what each other had to say.
So, Janice, something a lot of kids are grappling with is what is called temporal scarcity. Explain to us what that is and why you think it might be something that both very young people and very old people might find especially relevant.
Well, temporal scarcity is just the reality that our life is finite, and one day it will end. And so the amount of time that we have on this earth is scarce. And it is a way of thinking about death and the meaning of death in life. And I've been starting to think, because I notice, as I said earlier, that children are reliably interested in death. They want to talk about what it means that we live mortal lives. And I think part of the reason is it's new for them. And I've been wondering if it's at the beginning and end of life that we're most in touch with this, when death is a new concept to us and when it's becoming a nearer concept to us. I think when children first become aware that this life they're so excited to be a part of is going to end one day, it can be quite a shocking experience for them, and they're trying to grapple with it. And then at the end of life, I think we often start to think about, how have we lived our lives? Are we satisfied with what we've done with the finite time that we have? And in between, I think sometimes we can get caught up in just all the demands of our daily lives and don't maybe think as much about the impact or force that death plays in our life, except maybe when we're grieving.
How do child philosophers cope with the idea that they're raising these big, important questions and there may not be one single correct answer to any of them?
You know, it's interesting. In my experience, at least, children are way more comfortable with that than most adults. And I think that part of the reason is they don't carry around as many assumptions about what they already know. They're aware that there's a lot about the world they don't know. And so the idea that they might change their minds or that there aren't final answers to things, on many subjects at least, seems to be less problematic for children than for adults.
Another thing you love about children is that they ask questions about things that adults already take for granted about the basic realities of life and society. Can you give us some examples of that?
Sure. Well, so for example, one example is I've had this great conversation with children about friendship and about whether it is important, for example, we had this wonderful conversation with a group of, I think it was fourth graders, about whether it's important to show up at birthday parties. Now, you might not think that this is necessarily a philosophical question, right? Whether it's important to be at a birthday party. And in Seen and Not Heard, I write about this conversation where one child says, and I'll just quote, she says, "If you feel kind of lonely and down, and it's a birthday party with a lot of people, or even not a lot of people, but you just don't feel like working yourself up to it and you want to be alone, then if they're a really good friend, they'll probably understand. We had this whole conversation about, with the children, quite many of them disagreeing with each other about whether you have to show up for your good friends' birthday parties. And I'm the kind of person that I always think it's important to show up for your friends' important events. You should just, unless you have a really good excuse, you should be there. And the conversation with the children made me actually rethink that and think about whether, if I really want my friend to be there, but she doesn't really want to be there, either because she's having a hard day or she's just really uncomfortable in a crowd or whatever it is, am I being a good friend if I'm expecting her to do something that really won't make her very happy? Isn't being a good friend wanting her to do whatever is going to help her to flourish and not necessarily it be about my needs? And it really made me rethink this whole kind of principle I've always had about showing up for things, and it's one thing to decide for yourself you're going to show up for everything. It's another thing to expect your friends to do that, because friends are different from one another, right? Some friends are more introverted, etc. And anyway, it's made me think a lot about this question, and it's the kind of question that you probably wouldn't have a half-hour conversation with a group of adults about, but it actually is a really important topic, I think.
It is. And what's interesting about it is that if you did try to have this conversation with a group of adults, everybody would have come to a solid conclusion, right? Either they'd say, I'm the kind of person who shows up every time, or they'd say, I got to take care of myself. And if I don't want to go, I don't go. We're not necessarily thinking deeply about these things anymore.
Well, and I think that adults, though, want to think deeply about things. I mean, my experience working with groups of teachers and adults, we do lots of workshops for adults about how to engage in philosophical conversations with children. And in those workshops, we generally start by having these kinds of conversations ourselves, because one of the things we want teachers and parents and others to take away from this is we're not teaching you how to do philosophy with children, just as we don't want you to teach children philosophy. So we're trying to model just having these conversations. And I will say that adults come every time we do these workshops, people say to us, I hadn't realized how much I had longed for having these kinds of conversations with people. I never get a chance to do this. So I don't think it's that we're not interested as adults. I just think there aren't often places and spaces that make that available to us.
We filter so many of our views about the world these days through the lens of our politics. Is there a way that we can all set that aside to think about what we really think?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I find is really helpful about these kinds of philosophical conversations is that they sort of try to get to the all the underlying assumptions. And I think when we filter our conversations through politics, we're often operating at kind of a more superficial level, right? Like, I believe, this is the right way for the country to deal with immigration, say, or whatever. And we're not really asking, why do you think that's the right way? Not because this is the politically most advantageous or going to work the best or the most practical solution, but what are your underlying values here? Because my view is, when I talk about politics with people, and I try to do so with people who have very different views than I do, is that if we start with where we can agree, I think most of us can all agree we're trying to make the country a better place, right? So if we can start there, okay, so what would make the country a better place? We might have different ways of seeing that. So for example, I had a conversation with a group of fifth graders a few years ago that I also write about in Seen and Not Heard, where this was a group of kids, many of whom were very new to the country. And it was during the taking the knee, the beginning of the whole football, taking the knee during the national anthem. And several of the children were making the case that this was a way of supporting anti-racism work, and they really understood it and they sympathized with the players. And this one young girl who was from Somalia and was pretty new to the country got up and said something like, I totally sympathize with why they're doing this, but I can't watch it. It makes me so uncomfortable. It just stands against everything that my family and I have gotten from this country. I love the pledge and the national anthem, and I just makes me really uncomfortable. And it was clear that for her, there was a sacredness that to the pledge and the national anthem that was a different kind of way of looking at it than some of the other children. And it was a really wonderful exchange between the children who really started to understand a little more as well, and I did too, how different people can see the same event differently without labeling each other as, wrong for this reason or that reason.
Something else you appreciate about very young philosophers is that they come to this with what's called a beginner's mind. What are the advantages of that?
Well, I think there are a number of advantages. One is when you're doing philosophy, if you're trying to think about, for example, what makes something real, are mental objects, is love real, are only physical objects real, and how do we tell? It really helps to enlist your imagination, because imagination helps us to come up with new ways of thinking, to kind of push at our assumptions about what we think we already know. And children are great at that. They're creative thinkers. They're unafraid to play with ideas. They are, as I've said, less sure that they know a lot. And they also seem like they're less self-conscious about being perceived as knowing a lot. Adults often, we don't want to be seen as unsophisticated or as not knowing something everyone else knows. Children, especially children, say under the age of 11, that's not something that they seem to be particularly concerned about.
When schools bring you on to work with their students, what are they hoping will come out of that?
It depends on the classroom. Some schools are very interested in the sort of critical thinking that comes out of philosophical engagement, because a lot of what we focus on is learning how to give good reasons, being able to articulate your reasons, anticipating why someone might object, all these kinds of critical thinking sorts of skills. Others are very interested in the more social and emotional aspects of these philosophical conversations, learning how to listen to other people, recognizing that there are lots of different ways to see the world, understanding that if you and I disagree, it doesn't mean that necessarily one of us is right and one of us is wrong. It might just be that we have different ways of understanding whatever it is we're talking about. And sometimes the schools are interested in more of the sort of conflict resolution aspect of this. Sometimes teachers will tell me, I hear these anecdotes all the time, that they'll hear kids out on the playground at recess saying things to each other like, well, that's your view. I have a different view. And they attribute that to philosophy as opposed to, you're wrong and, I don't like you anymore or whatever.
So, as you point out in the piece, a lot of adults only get philosophy instruction formally after, or if they get to college. Was there a time when philosophy was an earlier part of the school curriculum?
Well, that's an interesting question, Chris. And not in my experience, not in this country at least. And I don't think it's true in very many countries. It is certainly true that in many countries around the world, philosophy is introduced in high school and is a basic part of the high school curriculum. But before that, I don't believe that introducing philosophy at a sort of an early age, at least in the sort of structured way that we're doing it, has been ever part of our history. And I think because of that, many adults, as you say, the first time they're introduced to philosophy is in a college class. And so I'll often have adults say to me, how could this possibly be appropriate for children? But of course, we don't do philosophy with children, as I've said, in the way you would you would experience in an undergraduate philosophy class.
So, this is not a knock on the sort of canon of Western philosophers, but they do tend to be uh, white men almost exclusively. Are philosophy programs beginning to take into account great works of philosophy, great thinkers from other cultures besides those of Europe and North America?
Oh, I definitely think so. I mean, certainly in our work, we are very aware and focused on using, for example, picture books that are from all authors of very diverse backgrounds, et cetera. But I also, my understanding, working in academia, is that many departments now are looking for and utilizing texts from a much wider variety of people and philosophers than was true certainly when I did my graduate work and undergraduate work in philosophy.
When you work with teachers who say we've been hungering for this too, it certainly points to a need to have these conversations. I mean, people join book clubs, but often those book clubs are like wine and snacks clubs. Are there places where adults can seek one another out to have these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I think there are starting to be more and more. There are some meetup philosophy groups. There are, I think they're calling them Socratic cafes that happen. You know, in Europe, there's often this sort of cafe style philosophical conversations that happen. It's less part of our cultural heritage, but it is starting to pop up here and there. And we have been talking about trying to do more and more intergenerational
Hmm.
work where we bring together children, and we do some of that, but we've been talking about really expanding it where we have conversations between children and or young people or teenagers and adults of all ages. And when we have done those kinds of events, they're really wonderful because people are able to kind of cross these age lines, which are very rigid in our society, and have conversations with people with whom they ordinarily might not interact.
How do you get the adults past there? Oh, just wait. You'll understand this when you're my age. How do you get them past that so that they can really listen to their young adult or teenage companions in these exercises?
I think that it doesn't take that much,
Hmm.
to tell you the truth, because when the kids start talking, often the adults will be really taken by how thoughtful the children are and will really want to hear what they have to say. I mean, I have seen time and time again adults who come up and say to me or say to the children, wow, that is just so interesting. I would have never thought of it like that. And I think that it really is. I mean, people want to help children to grow up into confident, thoughtful, loving people. And so when you're engaged in something and you can see that this is a positive experience for the child, you can see the child starting to blossom into it. In my experience, at least, it's the rare adult who wants to squelch that.
Assuming that their conclusions about things are not, morally wrong, as in our example earlier, how, Jana, do we as adults unlatch from the expectation that when this conversation is over, our children will have come around to thinking exactly as we do?
Mm. You know, one of the things that I've learned in this work is that often, if we really listen to children, our views will start to change. And actually, research has shown that children can be very influential in families on questions like climate change, for example, and other issues where parents might hold one view, but as they start to listen to their children, they start to change. I do think that most parents want their children to share their values, but I also think that if we are open to recognizing that our children are individuals and are going to grow up to be the people they're going to grow up to be and will be different from us in many ways, that we can also learn from them, and then our world expands as well.
Jana Moore-Lone is director and founder of the University of Washington Center for Philosophy for Children and affiliate associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Washington. You can read her essay, Philosophy with Children, at Aeon. Jana, thank you so much for making time for us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Think is a production of KERA in Dallas. Our team includes Stephen Becker, Paige Phelps, Ana Perez, Nilofer Arsala, and Micaela Rodriguez. Our interns are Angelica Perez, Tammy George, and Marissa Green. You can listen to Think wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Chris Boyd. Have a great day.